Buenos días, Professor Bill Messina. Thank you for participating in Conversatorio Cubano. We are now celebrating our third anniversary, and it is a great, great honor to have you join us.
I
I
really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Well, I want to start by asking you, since you are really a veteran of the University of Florida and of studies on Cuba, when you would say the Cuban Studies program at the University of Florida really began, and what do you think propelled that process?
Well, our work in Cuba really began in the early 1990s, and it was the vision of a colleague, mentor, and a dear friend, the late Jose Alvarez, Pepin to his friends. He and I were part of a team of faculty at the time doing a lot of research on the economic implications of the North American Free Trade Agreement. What were the impacts going to be on Florida agriculture? And we took a step back and we said, what other trade related issues are there coming up that could potentially affect Florida agriculture? At the time, Cuba was in the early years of the special period in peacetime following their loss of Soviet subsidization. And the economy, the prospects for the Cuban economy at the time were not very good. There were some who were anticipating that the Cuban economy and the Cuban government could collapse. And if that had been the case, the expectation was that U.S. Policy toward Cuba would change substantially and rapidly. And Cuba's agriculture and Florida's agriculture have historically been very, very similar. Heavy emphasis on sugar, citrus, vegetables, tropical fruit, and fisheries, if you want to broadly describe agriculture. And so we felt that if U.S. policy toward Cuba were to change significantly, the impacts on Florida agriculture could be substantial. So Pepin wanted to flesh that out a little bit more, and he envisioned a collaborative program of work back and forth with Cuban colleagues, Cuban economists, to try and flesh out these issues. At the time, I was working on trade policy issues related to Central America and the Caribbean and Mexico, and in the middle of that region, we had this huge hole. There was Cuba. We had next to no data or information on Cuba or their agricultural sector. So when he asked me, because of my geographic focus at the time, to get involved with him trying to launch a Cuba project, I jumped at the opportunity. So in 1991, we started working on a project proposal. We submitted it in 1992. In 1993, we were able to obtain a grant, the first of a series of grants, actually, from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. And in January of 1994, we made our first trip down to Cuba and sat down with economists at Centro de Investigaciones de Economía Internacional at the University of Havana to propose an active, collaborative, two-way research project, not just us telling them what needed to be done. We tossed out our ideas of what we thought should be done, and they gave us their feedback. And they liked ideas 1, 2, and 3. They weren't very keen on number 4, but they gave us a couple ideas, and we worked together to develop a joint collaborative project that started really in 1994.
Mm-hmm. Well, I joined the faculty in 2010 after a couple of stints elsewhere. You joined the faculty here in 1989.
89. Mm-hmm.
And in just the time that I have been here, attitudes towards academic exchanges and collaboration and research in Cuba have changed dramatically, sometimes reversed, sometimes taken a forward course. So how would you explain the kind of changes in attitudes that you might have seen since 1989 towards exchanges with Cuba? And what do you think accounts for those changes in attitudes?
Well, it's work with Cuba has always been viewed with caution here at Florida. And it's always been influenced by both national and state level politics and policy. The primary concern has been the reaction of the Cuban American community in Miami and Cuban American legislators who hold a lot of sway in the halls in the Florida legislature. I work at the University of Florida in the Institute of Food and Agricultural Science, known by its acronym IFAS. And IFAS administrators, we've always had to keep them informed of our work, and they've always been a little nervous about it. But the way we explained it to them was that if policy changes significantly, there's going to be implications for Florida agriculture. And if we aren't well informed about the situation in Cuba to help Florida growers anticipate both the potential for competitive challenges, as well as opportunities for potential business investment in Cuba, if we weren't well informed on those issues, we were going to be embarrassed. And they always agreed with us, but they always asked us to be careful. And we were always careful to follow not just the letter of the law, both state and federal, but the spirit of the laws as well. And as a result, we've never gotten in trouble with any legal issues related to our research. But there's a very good example of the political sensitivity, and it occurred in the context of a conference that we were planning to hold in Washington, D.C., where a team of our faculty and our colleagues from the University of Havana were going to travel to Washington and do a series of presentations based on our collaborative research on agricultural commodity sectors and competitive issues, potentially competitive issues. Well in advance of the event, we sent out notices to broadly because we wanted great attendance, and those notices included announcements to Florida's state and federal level politicians and elected officials. Never heard anything until just a couple weeks before the event, and a Cuban-American legislator called U.S. President at the time, John Lombardi, and demanded that the conference be canceled. President Lombardi naturally contacted us to get some information on the project. We provided him with all of the background information. And what worked to our advantage in this instance, John Lombardi was a Latin American historian by training. And so he had an appreciation for what it was we were trying to do and the importance of our work. So he actually responded to the legislator and said, not only wasn't he going to cancel the conference, but he said if legislators really wanted Florida, the University of Florida, to be a top-notch academic institution, this is exactly the sort of forward-thinking research that we needed to do. And actually, that put an end to the controversy. But there have been other controversies. For example, a number of years later, we were organizing a conference. It wasn't about Cuba specifically. It was about global sugar markets, and Cuba was a major player in global sugar markets. So we were going to have a couple of our colleagues from the University of Havana come up and participate. And at that point, Cuban-American legislators learned to hit the University of Florida where it hurts, in the pocketbook. This was during the legislative session. Cuban-American legislators called the vice president of IFAS and said that if we went ahead with the conference, they would guarantee that the IFAS budget would be cut. So in that case, we had to cancel the conference. Pardon me. Very disappointing. And then a third example, for years, Cuban-American legislators have been trying to pass legislation that prohibited state university faculty from working in Cuba, but they were never able to get broad enough support. In 2006, they were able to accomplish their goal by passing legislation that prohibited state universities from funding travel to or doing research work in countries designated as state sponsors of terrorism. And at the time, Cuba was on that list, the State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism. So that severely hampered our work. Pepin Alvarez and Emerita Professor, former director of the UF Center for Latin American Studies, Carmen Diana Deer, were actually plaintiffs in a case brought by the ACLU challenging the legality of that legislation. There were also professors from FIU, University of Central Florida, and University of South Florida. Pardon me. However, the legal case was not successful. So the restrictions remained in place until Cuba was removed from the state sponsors of terrorism list by President Obama. Interestingly, one of the last decisions before leaving office that President Trump made was to put Cuba back on the state sponsors of terrorism list, and they remain there today.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and the great irony is that, of course, as a Cubanist, back in the 90s when I was doing my PhD, I was not being trained by specialists of Cuba. And so they told me the truth, which is that you cannot be a legitimate scholar of any country unless you actually live in that country, spend time in that country, do the bulk of your research in that country. And my career has depended on that, including 3 of the last 5 books that I have published at the University of Florida. If I hadn't been able to travel to Cuba to do the research, to do the interviews, to sit in archives for hours and hours and hours and hours and literally sit and transcribe, because in Cuba, we don't have scanners. And when we do, the Cuban government doesn't want us to use them. So, in general, I was able to take advantage of that aperture, which is now closed, as you just said. Yeah. So from your perspective, what do you think the greatest impact in the time when we did have exchanges with Cuba, including the Center for Latin American Studies' most recent convenio or exchange with the National Library? I mean, I would date it, further back so that you could comment. But what do you think was the greatest impact that these kinds of exchanges had in scholarly terms, in humanitarian terms, however you might want to explain it?
Well, your research and ours were very different. For us, we can read about what's going on in the agricultural sector in Cuba, but the importance of the collaboration was for us to be able to sit with Cuban scholars and discuss the issues, and also to get out and see farms and agricultural production and processing systems, and at the same time, to bring them to the United States and allow them to see our farms and our production systems and our infrastructure, which was really overwhelming for them. I mean, simply going into a Walmart, super Walmart anywhere in the state, there were probably more consumable goods in that one store than there were on the entire island of Cuba. And agriculture, the infrastructure that we have, the storage capacity for citrus juice, the processing facilities for sugar, all of these were really, it was important for them to see it. And it was important for us to see the condition of their infrastructure and the lack of infrastructure. Gives you a much fuller picture of the situation. The reality is we've got a great deal to learn from scientists in other countries, and they have a great deal to learn from us. And these exchanges of information, I think, make the world a better place. They allow us to do research that's better targeted on important issues and important problems. And also, the more information that we are able to provide allows our politicians and policymakers to make better informed decisions. So I think that's really the key importance of academic collaborations and exchanges, and we're going to lose that with the current situation with respect to Cuba.
Yes, I would also add that we are featuring Jose Alvarez's book, which is one of many, but Frank País, Architect of Cuba's Betrayed Revolution, in our Ex Libris feature this month. He wrote another book in Spanish, whose title describes very well how he viewed, as an agricultural economist, the policymaking internally on the island and its results, and that was to call it disorganized organization. Organized disorganization. Yeah. Both of those work. And I would say that it's in the process of witnessing in person how things work that one really understands the truth, because in the end there are many truths. There is the official one, there is how people witness and experience that one and may perhaps reproduce it in the absence of evidence to support it. And then there are tons of other hidden truths that nobody sees, nobody recognizes, because Cuba, like any other country, has a top level administration that rarely sits with the average guy or the average lady, or however you might want to put it, in their home, in the schoolroom, in a healthcare center on a daily basis, and sees the reality. So your comment about how Walmart today, any Walmart, the ones in Gainesville, would potentially represent more than what is available on the island is true. I mean, that's accurate. I don't think that's an exaggeration today at all. And so it kind of begs the question, when we look at the fact that it's currently legally impossible for me to go to Cuba and to conduct research there using state funds, one wonders, what are we missing? We have right now, on this very day, the 5th of December, yet another nationwide blackout on the island. By my count, it's number 3, if not 4. And so, at the very most basic level, as an observer of contemporary Cuba and its relationship to the past, I am missing that. I have no way of documenting, discussing, thinking about, other than to speculate how individual Cubans in any area of Cuba have experienced and interpreted that national crisis. So that's one of the things that I would say we're missing. But what do you think we're missing by making it legally impossible for faculty to go to Cuba, for scholars to go to Cuba and conduct research there?
Well, I'm sure you've experienced this. We're still in contact via email with our colleagues down in Cuba, and when you're discussing issues, you can always tell that there's more to the story, but they don't feel comfortable expressing that in email because they're concerned about their email being monitored, and so we're only seeing kind of a shadow picture of what's actually happening down there right now. And I think in addition to the constraints that you and I face in trying to conduct our collaborative research, I think our students miss out a lot. And I base this, many years ago, I used to teach our undergraduate international development policy course. And I love teaching the class because it really introduced US students, at least, to an entire new world that they were not aware of. And I know that early in my career, I didn't know much about developing countries. Until I started selling agricultural equipment into Central America. This was before I joined the University of Florida. And until you get your feet on the ground and really see what's going on, you only have a poor impression and a poor picture of how things are. One of the things I used to do on the first day of class is I would bring in a cup of Starbucks coffee. And I'd ask the students how much it cost, and of course they all knew. I think at the time it was about $1.50, and I would tell them that about a third of the world's population lived on less than that per day, and that was really a way to kind of capture the interest of the students. Introducing them to developing countries in a course was good and it's helpful, but it isn't nearly as impactful as seeing things firsthand. I remember the first time my wife and I took our sons down to Cuba, to Mexico, and they were 16 and 13 at the time. And that was a real eye opener for them because they saw that not everybody lives the way we do here in the United States. So these are the things that we're missing. Do we want our students to read about Cuba, or do we want them to have the opportunity to go down and actually talk with the people and see how things work on a day-to-day day-to-day basis for them? It's a whole new experience, and one they're not going to have the opportunity to pursue here at a state university in Florida.
Yes, and freedom of thought is foundational to democracy. Mm-hmm. So when we don't replicate that and we don't embody that, then we are not good models of democracy, and we have little ground to stand on, undoubtedly. I really want to thank you for your wonderful contributions to the University of Florida, to the study of Cuba, to the many other ways that you have contributed to the study of agricultural economics, and for your frankness today and willingness to meet in December, no less, at the height of our professional struggle to grade and to get everything done in time for our students. So thank you so much, Bill.
You are most welcome. It's a real pleasure. Thank you, Lily.